Science is stumped by strange mummies in Utah. No possible explanation yet to account for the red-headed, wavy-haired, perhaps white race in America, thousands of years before the Indians or even the cliff dwellers. The type of thoroughly explored Utah cliff dwelling, deep beneath which were found the mummies and remains of the mysterious, lost, red-headed American race, by Dr. W. H. Ballou. Those who have the habit of thinking that the original inhabitants of America were either straight and black-haired people, like the Indians, with coppery skins, or little brown-skinned dwellers in the pueblos of the West, like the Hopi Indians, will probably be just as surprised as science is now to learn that 10,000 years ago, at least, there lived in Utah a red-haired, presumably fair-skinned race. It may be that this vanished folk had their abode in other parts of what is now the United States. There are legends extant of a fair people dwelling in the New World long before Columbus discovered it, and these legends are found in the very oldest strata of Indian folklore. In the light of recent discoveries, science is turning away from its scornful disregard of these stories, which it has hitherto regarded as absurd. The mummies, which have revealed the existence of these red-haired Americans, were found in caves under the houses of the cliff dwellers in Grand Gulch, southeastern Utah. There is clear evidence that they had entirely disappeared centuries before the cliff dwellers, themselves now a vanished race, took up their abode within the precipices of the canyons. A number of well-preserved bodies, together with weapons, garments, basketware, and utensils, are now under examination at the American Museum of Natural History, New York. The public will not be permitted to see them for some time, as they are being studied by Mr. B.T.B Hyde, the museum's expert, from whom no statement will be issued until his researches are complete. Other museums at Harvard, Pennsylvania, Chicago, Yale, and Denver universities also have their quota of the mummies, but these institutions will await the verdict of Mr. Hyde before giving out any results of their own examination. The bodies, although so ancient, have been excellently preserved by the extraordinarily dry air of the place in which they lived and were buried. Their hair ranges from what is called Titian to a violent red. The hair of the babies and youngsters is distinctly wavy. At least one important fact can be deduced from this. The red-haired Americans, whoever they were, did not come from Asia, as there is good reason for believing the American Indian did. Anthropologists have all agreed on just 3 types of hair for mankind, existing and extinct. These types are straight black hair, kinky hair, and wavy blonde hair. All shades of red are included in the word blonde. We do not know yet whether these 3 types originated simultaneously in different sections of the world, or whether one type followed another, nor do we know which is the oldest or original type. If single origin of mankind, a matter in hypothetical dispute, be decided upon. But we do know that the Asiatic, in its pure stock, invariably possesses the straight hair. How did these people live, and what was it that caused their extinction? The first question we can answer, at least in part, from the necessarily superficial examination made of their homes, and the artifacts and weapons found in their strange graves. The second question is unanswerable as yet. They may have been wiped out by an epidemic of disease, and examination of their withered skin and muscle and bones may reveal what this was. Or they may have died out through some weakening of the racial strain. Whatever the cause, it was not warfare. There must have been a period when the dwindling remnants of their tribe lived in a great loneliness. In one of the caves, the searchers found what may be called a page from the end of their volume, and it can be read in part. We know that the burial ceremonies of this people must have been extremely elaborate. They took their dead and placed them in potholes, which they dug in the floor of their cavern. These potholes they lined with a baked clay, and in them they put, doubled up and squatting, the body of the dead. Then they covered the cadaver with beautiful feathers and sometimes rabbit skin robes, placing beside the man or woman or child arms, ornaments, dishes, and toys. After that, the body was covered with closely woven baskets, the taps of which were covered with sand and earth. Owing to the peculiar dryness of the caverns, the bodies, instead of decaying, slowly dried. The flesh, writes Dr. George H. Pepper of the American Museum, wasted away until the skin flattened on the skeleton, leaving the hair and eyebrows intact, with ears, nose, and skin of the face and other fleshy parts of the body in so perfect a condition as to be sometimes almost lifelike. In one case, searchers found the withered body of an old woman crouching against the side of the rocky wall. Her hair still retained some of its auburn coloring. The mummy squatted there, and even the centuries had not wiped out from her face and her attitude the seal of resignation and sorrow. They found in this cave 7 potholes, in each of which was a body, one of them of a little child. The withered old figure, still sitting so patiently, had been the last of this family, perhaps the grandmother. One by one she had seen her mate, her children, and her grandchildren die, and she had helped to place them away according to the customs and rituals of her people, and at last she was left alone. There she sat and waited for death to come to her, among her own dead. There was no one to bring her food or water, and when at last she died, there was no one to give her the burial which had been afforded her own beloved dead. Was she the last woman of the red-haired Americans? It is not impossible, for had there been others living about her in any of the other caverns, they surely would have prepared her body, even as she had prepared so often those others who had passed into the unknown. And if this were so, what must her loneliness have been? In all the world outside, she must have thought that no other being like herself existed. Outside the cave were nothing but prowling beasts and perils. Someone has written that the most awful fear one could feel would be to know oneself the last living person in the world, and then to hear at one's door someone knocking. Anticipation of such terror this old woman of the red-haired Americans conceivably experienced, squatting there in her dark cavern alone. The mummies of Grand Gulch form the greatest riddle with which anthropologists have had to deal. No other known race has presented such perplexities. They were found while the workers were excavating the cliff dwellings which originally towered along almost the whole stretch of the canyon for 50 miles. Invariably, when they dug down to the cellars of the cliff dwellers, then dug through the floors, they would find that there were still beneath filled-up caves in which a mummy or several mummies were buried in artificial potholes, covered with the most primitive basketry known. No pottery whatever was found with the remains. The only weapon found with them was an occasional atlatl, or stick thrower, or spear thrower, as they have been successfully termed, of the most primitive form of the 4 types of this weapon. It was noted by experiment that the stick thrower could be sent with just power enough to kill a rabbit only. It was further noted that the skulls in the caves were long heads, while the skulls of the cliff dwellers above were flattened behind. These and other puzzles have caused the anthropologists to defer decisive investigation in hopes of getting more evidence on which to base conclusive facts. By common consent of the institutions involved, the problem has been left to Mr. Hyde to solve from the scanty material unearthed from time to time. It is doubtful if he will be able to point to a finality without organizing another expedition, without ample means to clean up the whole gulch along its bottom. Such an expedition is certain to be formed and financed directly by the American Museum. The late Otis T. Mason of the Smithsonian Institution took up one phase of the problem which was regarded as conclusive. He was our great authority on basketry, and at first the Grand Gulch troglodytes were named basket makers, but have since been taken out of that class because basket making has ever been universal from almost the beginning. He noted that their basketry was of positively the most primitive coiled type, as distinguished from the more modern woven type. In this he was supported by Dr. George H. Pepper. He wrote as follows in his great work on basketry, published by the Smithsonian Institution. Their baskets were of the coiled type, made of willow, the bottoms reinforced with heavy yucca cord border, finished with ordinary coiled stitch. But in some, the last inch or 2 is finished off with false braid or herringbone. The type in general is still in use by the Paiutes and Shoshones, and is seen in ordinary Japanese lunch baskets and baskets of Samoa and Straits of Magellan. The coiled type was that of the most ancient tribes of Egypt, made of palm leaf, excavated by McIver and Wilkin at Al Arma, 6 miles south of the site of Abydos in Middle Egypt. It is the oldest type in the world. El Arma dates back to the earliest new race through the entire Middle Period down to the late prehistoric of Egypt. It was the single type through 6,000 years, extending far up the Nile to Aden and into Hindustan. Long caravans took it into the heart of Africa, where it still persists. The presence of the wooden stick or spear and its slight killing power shows the red-haired people were completely isolated. No other human beings or tribes could have been near. Had they been, they would have been forced to develop a primitive armament. Dr. George H. Pepper, quoting Richard Weatherhill, describes their home as follows. Grand Gulch drains nearly all the territory southwest of the Elk Mountains, from the Macomb Wash to the Clay Hills, about 1,000 square miles of territory. It is the most tortuous canyon in the whole southwest, making bends from 200 to 600 yards apart almost the entire length, or for 50 miles, and each bend means a cave or overhanging cliff. All of those cliffs which have an exposure to the sun have been occupied either for cliff houses or as burial places. The canyon is from 300 to 700 feet deep, and in many places toward the lower end the bends are cut through by nature, making natural bridges. Under these bridges in some cases are houses, and in such places are pictographs in the greatest profusion. Ingress and egress is very difficult, there being not more than 5 or 6 places where even footmen can get into or out of the canyon. Water is fairly plentiful. Springs occur at very frequent intervals, running a short distance and sinking in the sand, perhaps to rise again lower down. Wherever there are slopes, a sparse growth of pinyon and cedar occurs. About the springs are cottonwoods, mountain ash, and hackberry. In snaked side canyons are mountain ash and hackberry. The usual bush of the canyon is scrub oak. Canes or rushes cover the bottomlands in the vicinity of water. This then was the home of the basket maker, so far as we know. The cliff dwellers practiced artificial flattening of the head, confined to the back portion of the skull, as pronounced in women as men. The skull of the cliff dweller was broad, short, and flattened. Of the basket maker, narrow, elongate, and normal. The cliff dweller used the bow and arrow. The burial caves is 22 feet in diameter, where skulls and mummies she found long since filled with sand. The basket maker used a throwing stick, the nearest neighbor of which is found in Chihuahua, Mexico, in form of the atlatl. There were other implements peculiar to the basket maker, one of which is similar to the rabbit stick used by the Hopi Indians today. The most striking feature was the absence of houses and caves and the mummification of dead in potholes under baskets. The potholes, lined with baked clay, were 22 feet in diameter, where skulls and mummies she found. The basket makers rank below mummies from Pelashuco, Bolivia, excavated by the late Dr. Adolf F. Bandelier for the American Museum. These Bolivians made pottery, a step in advance of the basket makers. The next higher type of mummies were found by Dr. Charles W. Mead in the region west of the Peruvian Cordillera, also for the American Museum, also used for storing grain. The largest of, and then it cuts off.